Well, for more on Egypt's economy and what this visit could mean for Cairo's relations with Washington, I spoke to Bessma Momani. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation and also a professor at the University of Waterloo's School of International Affairs. I began by asking how the meeting could shape U.S.-Egypt ties going forward.
Well, I think what you're going to see is less patronizing comments coming from the U.S. to Egypt. I think we're going to see a different relationship in the sense that probably, and for good or bad, we're going to see the Americans not talk about human rights or democracy promotion in Egypt. I think you're going to see a government that is going to be more hands-off and not really calling out Sisi and other potential political issues that arise in Egypt. There are, for example, 40,000 political prisoners in Egyptian prisons today. That's probably not going to be raised, at least not overtly. But I don't think there's going to be much change in the foreign aid package, which is what is expected. Of course, Sisi's coming to town hoping that there's going to be an increase in that foreign aid, particularly on the military side. I don't think that he's going to get that, particularly because Trump is asking for major cuts in much of the foreign aid budget. And of course, Egypt is the second largest recipient of that foreign aid budget. So I don't think there's much room there for Trump to actually increase it.
And speaking of foreign aid, we know that under the Obama administration, foreign aid was frozen at a certain point. It was also then reinstated. But as you mentioned, given Trump's budget cuts, especially when it comes to foreign aid, being that that is quite a sensitive issue, how do you think that might play out into relations between the two?
Well, again, I think what Trump is going to do is give him all the warm signals and the very positive reception, a lot of rhetoric, but I don't think Trump is going to deliver an increasing foreign aid. Again, I think it's going to be decreasing. There's just not enough room in the budget. 75% of the foreign aid goes to both Israel and Egypt. And of course, we know that the Israeli lobby inside Congress is probably far more stronger than that of Egypt. So I don't think they're going to touch the Israeli component. And so that really leaves, in this case, Egypt in the short stick. It's going to have to bear the brunt of some cuts here.
Now, being that there will be some cuts, let's look at other things that are going on with the Egyptian economy. How has it been faring over the last year or so?
Well, not doing well, partly because, of course, the government has put in some very strict economic reforms starting in November of last year. The big thing has been devaluation of Egyptian pound. We've seen rising inflation. That means a lot of goods that were imported are now going to be problematic and more expensive. And so I think there's real hardship felt on the streets of Cairo. Unemployment is up. Of course, with inflation, that means the price of goods for most people is higher. We're not seeing the kind of economic recovery that many had hoped for, partly because the regional political situation and even, I would say, the fact that Sisi is still very tough on a lot of activists does not resonate very well in the investor community. And so he's just not been able to get the economy starting again. And so it's going to take some time before we see Egypt return to that emerging market status that it once had about 5-10 years ago.
So given the reforms that they had to undertake in order to secure a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, what are we looking at potentially then long-term, being that there is so much stress right now with these austerity measures up front? What are we looking at going forward?
Well, I think the hope of the government and the IMF is that you would have these structural reforms to bring back foreign investment. There's been some really good work on streamlining investor laws, bankruptcy laws, and other sorts of legal reforms in an effort to bring more foreign investors. And the hope through the devaluation is to therefore make Egypt a more attractive destination. But, foreign investment and tourism, both key sectors, they're not getting the recovery that they had, partly because there's a lot of, I think, political uncertainty in Egypt. And of course, the fact that you have continued human rights allegations of abuse against prisoners and others makes many investors very uncomfortable with investing in Egypt. And of course, tourists themselves have been detracted from going because of the continued security situation of terrorist attacks inside Egypt. So all in all, I think it makes it very difficult for foreign investors to go to Egypt and thrive. And so the economy continues, frankly, to stagnate.
So given some of the political uncertainty and also the security concerns, for investors looking in the region, what would then perhaps draw them to Egypt?
Well, one of the things that really has drawn investors to Egypt is the population. I mean, you're looking at nearly 100 million people. That's a very large market, obviously the largest Arab market. So if you want to sort of produce goods for the Arab market, it's a very useful anchor to have. Of course, as well, its geostrategic position, being not just on the Suez Canal, but also being a useful gateway into Europe. Labor costs are very, very low relatively, and in some ways there's a sector of the society that's quite educated and speaks English well. So I would say there's a lot of things going well for Egypt, but it's really just about I would say the political risk is quite high, and of course the negative country brand because of the violence, the neighborhood, continues to mean that investors and tourists stay away.
And just lastly, any sort of trends of note that you're seeing that people maybe may not be aware of, but they should really put on their radar?
I would say the startup community. I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting about Egypt and many parts of the Middle East is, in fact, the entrepreneurial drive. So really not the large corporations, but the small and medium-sized enterprises. They're thriving. And I would say, in many ways, not with thanks to the government, but because of their own gumption. They're really, I think, trying very hard in an environment that makes it very difficult to operate, not always having access to finance, finding it very difficult to get foreign exchange. I mean, all of the sort of hurdles are amplified in Egypt, but yet I would say the startup community is really quite interesting, both in tech and in some very, I think, ingenious types of products and services.